various things about our tradition that I'd like you to know. And I thought I'd devote a few sessions to what I will call clearing up chronic misunderstandings and why they are important. And I'll try to cover them in about 10 minutes. First of all, you've all heard of Adam and Eve, I presume. And here's the problem with discussing Adam and Eve. Adam's name wasn't Adam, and Eve doesn't get her name until the very end of the Garden of Eden story. So we have this image that there are two people in Gan Eden, in the Garden of Delight, one named Adam and one named Eve. That's actually not what the text says. It's interesting to know that people, through generations and generations, have misread the text. That's okay with me. No harm is done. But it's always better in my mind to know what the text actually says. And then secondly, does it make any difference in how we read the text? So first of all, where do we get the name Adam or Adam? Remember, it's not a name, it's a species. Adam means something like humanity, from the Hebrew word Adamah, which is earth, from the Hebrew word Adom, which is red, probably from the word Adam, which is blood, but specifically in Genesis chapter 2, it connects it to the word Adamah. So when you hear the word Adam, think of following Genesis chapter 2, formed from the earth of the ground. So where do we first see the term Adam? If you go to Genesis chapter 25. It says, I'll go to the English, and God said, "Let us make man in our image after our likeness." To the Hebrew, Vayomer Elohim, Elohim said, "Na'aseh, let us make Adam, B'Tsalmenu Kidmutenu." Now here the word Adam is without the Hey HaYidiyah, without the word the, and therefore it means a human being. Afterwards, it says in verse, hold on a second. In verse 27, Vayivra Elohim et ha'adam, and Elohim created the human being, B'Tsalmo, B'Tselem, Elohim bara oto. And God created the human being in his image. In the image of Elohim, he created him, male and female, he created them. So what do you learn from here? It says, et ha'adam, the Adam, not the name Adam, but the species ha'adam. And then we find out in verse 27, it's a species that has both a male and a female. So in Genesis chapter 27, Adam refers to a species, we'll call it the human being. The human being has male and female from Genesis chapter 27. Chapter 27 does not name the human beings, does not call them Adam and Eve, but rather ha'adam, Zachar u'nekeva, male and female. Now we move forward over into Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2 is clearly written by a different author. Genesis chapter 1 is highly structured, poetic, very organized, themes of up and down and middle. We move over to Genesis chapter 2. It's clearly into a narrative, even a kind of a mythological narrative. Instead of the word bara, the idea of God creating something, it has the idea of God yotzer, or shaping something. So Genesis chapter 2 is more anthropomorphic than Genesis chapter 1. Let's take a look at what it says about creating the human being. If you go over to Genesis chapter 2, we're going to now go to chapter 2, verse 7. Chapter 2, verse 7, I'll start with the Hebrew. Vayitzer Adonai Elohim et ha'adam, afar min ha'adama, vayipach be'apav nishmat chayim, vayihi ha'adam lenefesh chaya. So to the English, vayitzer, liyatzer in Hebrew means to shape or form. Not bara, which is in the previous Torah portion, which is more generically to make. Here it has to shape. It says, Vayitzer Adonai Elohim et ha'adam, the human being, the species, Afar min ha'adamah, dust or ground from the earth. Here you see the connection between Adam and Adamah. Vayipach be'apav nishmat chayim, and he blew into his nostrils nishmat chayim. The sense here is that Adonai Elohim created an inert body, not yet animated, out of the earth in the shape of the species. And then it says that the divine blew into his nostrils. By the way, in Hebrew, you only have two, all nouns are either male or female. So that when it says, Vayipach be'apav, and it blew into his nostrils, it's a bit misleading, because it doesn't mean his as in Adam's, but rather the species, the human being. Nishmat chayim, a breath of life. This is where we get the word neshama. Neshama literally means breath. So as it were, the divine took a deep breath and blew it into the nostrils of the human being. So clearly the divine does not, from our conception, does not have a physical form, Ezekiel chapter 1 notwithstanding, and therefore it's something of a poetic metaphor that God breathes in, as it were, and then breathes out. But again, we don't know exactly what the ancient Hebrews thought about the corporality of the divine. Some people say that the ancient Israelites actually did believe that the divine had some kind of corporeal structure, certainly heavenly, beyond human conception, but it wasn't purely metaphysical and spiritual, but actually has some kind of divine body. And that's a very interesting study among Bible scholars. Did the ancient Israelites actually believe in, as it were, a divine body? Here it seems to say that the divine blows into the nostrils of the human being a nishmat chayim, and therefore, as an archetypal teaching, all human beings are animated by a nishmat chayim from the divine. That's probably the most important takeaway from chapter 2, is that if this is an archetypal story, each of us as part of the species Ha-Adam, the human being, we all carry within us a nishmat chayim, a breath of life from the divine. I'll be coming back to that in a moment. And then it says, Vayehi Ha-Adam, and then the Adam became a nefesh chaya. Now we have an interesting term here, the word nefesh. Sometimes the word nefesh, it means a soul. Sometimes neshama, breath, spirit, and nefesh are seen to be synonymous. Here they are clearly not. Because if the human being receives a nefesh chaya, a nishmat chayim, a breath of life, then becomes a nefesh chaya, it seems that nefesh here means a being, or maybe an alive being. A nefesh chaya, a nefesh that is now alive, nefesh chaya. Now, we don't really know exactly what these terms mean in their original context. The best we can do is look how the word nefesh is used in other parts of the Bible. And one other part of the Bible strikes me most importantly, and that's when it says that the nefesh is found in the blood. So it seems that the ancient Israelites believed in something called a life force. Life force was contained in the blood as long as the blood was circulating in the human body. And therefore the implication here is that once God blew a breath of life into the inert form of Ha-Adam, as it were, the blood began circulating and became a nefesh chaya, or a living life force, not a potential life force. Now, what's the takeaway of all this? Why is it important to know that in Genesis 1 and 2, and even in 3, the being does not have the name Ha-Adam, but rather the species, a human being. When I was a young rabbinical student, I heard someone refer to the original human being as the earthman. I thought it was kind of funny, and then I thought it's probably the best translation that we have. It's not his name, but rather the being that was created from the earth. So if you ever want to translate Ha-Adam in Genesis 1, 2, and 3, especially 2 and 3, earthman is probably the best. Next week I'll talk about Eve, but if you look in Genesis chapter 3, where Ha-Adam, earthman, and it says his woman, she's not called Eve until the very end of chapter 3. So in most of chapter 3, the Garden of Eden story, they don't have names. It's Earthman and his woman. Earthman and his woman. Later, at the very end of the story, the woman of Earthman gets the name Chava or Chava, which means life. We'll talk about that next week. Why is this important? It's important to me because it shows that the authors of this section of the Bible were thinking in an archetypal way. They weren't talking historically about a person named Adam and a person named Eve, but they were setting up an archetypal form called the human being, the feminine form of the human being, who later takes on her own archetypal name, which is life. When you read it this way and no longer call them Adam and Eve, but rather earth, man, and life. Earth, man, and life, you start to see the very deep kind of mythological and archetypal dimensions. Now, I will always call them Adam and Eve, because if I start calling them earth, man, and life, people will think I'm taking liberties with the accepted translation of the Bible. But I want you to know, when you start reading the early Genesis narratives, by the actual English translations, not the idea they had names, but by the actual English translations, earth, man, and life, you suddenly get the sense we're in something of an ancient Hebrew mythology trying to discuss the human condition. And we'll continue this next week. In my next week, 10 minutes of Judaism 101, random comments on our tradition.